you'll be praying for this kind of heat in this building. But it's good to see all of you tonight. I appreciate your being here. Sushil is here tonight, and Evelyn, and Alex, and Brianna. We're glad to see them able to be out and be back with us. Everybody be sure and look at the pretty baby. Boy, it is a pretty baby, too. Wow. I don't know exactly how they managed that, but I'm sure that it was genetics. I'm sure it was the father and mother that provided us with that beautiful child. Am I up here? Yes, I am. I'd like for you to look at Romans 1. And we're going to start reading there tonight. About verse 28. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. It would be wonderful to assume that every family is good, but it's not true. Oftentimes, families do not encourage the natural affection that Romans 1 spoke of. That should be part of the glue that binds our lives together. You know, you read in the paper about children, young children, 1 and 2 and 3 years old, that are abused and killed by nasty people. There's no other way to describe them. 2 Timothy 3, the first 7 verses, says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. Men shall be lovers of themselves, covetous, boasters, proud," and so on. In verse 3, I want you to notice, without natural affection. Over and over again, we see families that degenerate into sin. And sadly, they pass that degeneracy on to their children and the next generation of families. We'd like to think that the family is a key element, and it is a key element. But oftentimes the family isn't what it should be. Too often the seeds sown in our lives were sown when we were in the bosom of our families. We want to look at some examples of that in the Bible. Alan's studying with you I believe he's still in the 4th chapter of Genesis. And there Cain kills his brother Abel. You know, you think about, just for a moment, all of the evil that was involved in that decision. Covetousness, envy, malignity, rebellion, hatred. In Genesis 4, verse 3, beginning, "In the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground an offering to the Lord. You know, have you ever noticed that phrase, in the process of time? I'd like to think that this decision of Cain's, his hatred and anger, was just a snap judgment. We all know that sometimes something can happen or somebody can say something. We quickly lose our temper, and then in another moment, just as quick, we regret what we've done. But that wasn't true. And that's not the way it happens in families. This didn't happen overnight. In the process of time, this happened. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, and Alan's been talking about that. Some of the conjectures and possibilities about why God respected one offering and not the other. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect, and Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. You can look at all sorts of reasons, motivations. But the real root reason was that one was offered in faith and the other one wasn't. And faith comes by hearing by the word of God. And so we have to assume that God had told them what to sacrifice on this occasion. There were other occasions when God told them to offer vegetables. This wasn't one of them. And so we have to assume that Cain made the decision not to offer what God had told them to offer. The Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth? Why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Says you need to realize what struggle you're fighting. It's a struggle inside yourself. A struggle that has not come about overnight, but something that you've been building up to for a long time. Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. The Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Alan called this, I've forgotten the exact wording he used, but one of the most malicious statements you can find in the Bible. Who is my brother? Callous, that was his word. I'll learn to quote you precisely next time. It was a good statement. He said, am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. In 1 John 3, verses 14 through 21, hate only matures after a long cultivation. And that could go on in a family where brothers and sisters grow to hate one another. They ought to love one another. They grew up that way. They should love one another, but often they don't. We know that we've passed from death unto life because we love the brethren. He that loveth not his brother abideth in death. Now, brethren, we've been together in this congregation for years. If you can't love one another, we're in trouble. How in the world can the Lord love us if we can't love one another? Every now and then I see some church situation where brethren have gotten in a fuss. The preacher becomes resentful, or the brethren become resentful. And I wonder, even though somebody did you wrong, even though there's reason to be upset maybe, how can that go on very long? How can that hatred nurture? It didn't happen just suddenly. You haven't loved one another for a long time. or those brethren haven't. Got a preacher friend right now that mad at everybody in the church where he used to be. At least he seems to be. Can't say a kind word about them. You know, I'm sorry. The church had troubles, but they're all still the same people he worshiped with for years. Known most of his life. He didn't love them, even though they're occasionally fools. Goodness knows, everybody in this church that hadn't occasionally done a foolish thing, raise your hand. Yeah, I didn't think so. Don't you put your hand up. I live next door to you. Hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us. We ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. Do you think you deserve that? You are so good and so wonderful that the Lord should die for you? Whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And hereby we know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before him. For if our heart condemn us, God is greater than our heart, and knoweth all things. If our heart condemn us not, then have we confidence toward God. You know, Isaac and Rebekah, you remember the story? They had 2 sons. You remember that? It's in Genesis 27. She had 2 children. Twins. Jacob and Esau. It's in Genesis 27, the story. And they grew up, and Rebekah decided to deceive her old husband into blessing the youngest son. Perhaps there was a good reason for doing it. I don't know. The Bible doesn't ever say. In Genesis 25, beginning in verse 21, we're not going to read all of that. And we'll start at 24. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. The boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Ooh-wee. You think that was good for the family? For the father to love one child and the mother to love the other? It wasn't good. Was it good for her to deceive her husband? Probably not. She may have known God's plan. He's called Jacob, means the supplanter. Apparently, God had predicted that he would be the blessed child. So to give her a good motive, she may have been insistent on bringing that to pass, and this she felt was the only way. But once again, as in the case of Abraham, there seems to be a lack of confidence in God's ability to get a thing done. And look at what it caused in their lives. The years of division between those 2 young men. Years. They didn't see one another for 25 years or more. Scared to death of one another. Angry at one another. Consider the love wasted that couldn't ever be returned. And the families divided. As a result of this. Should have been a loving family, but it wasn't. Move on just a little bit further, and Jacob goes up north to his relatives and starts working for the family. Starts working for Laban. Look with me in Genesis 31, verse 4. Jacob summarizes his experience with the family. It says, Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock and said unto them, I see your father's countenance. He's worked for him for 21 years or more. That it is not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me. Now, you know what was wrong? He had married 2 of his daughters, but then in a business deal, he'd made a deal with his father-in-law and wound up with most of his flocks and herds because he was a better businessman than his father-in-law. Ye know that with all my power I have served your father, and your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God suffered him not to hurt me. That's in their own family. He was abusing his own son, at least his son-in-law, his own relative. He was related to him in addition to his being a son-in-law. He obviously put his money before his family. You know, Sushil, you've got 2 daughters now. You're going to make the fellas they marry, you're not even thinking about marriage yet for the kids, I know, but you're going to make them work for you for 14 years to make money off of them before you let them have the girls? I hope not. They put money ahead of the family. And then Jacob loved one of his wives more than the other. Do you think that was good? You know the history of it. In Genesis 29, verse 30, he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. Whew. How did that work out? Not at all. Hatred and jealousy throughout that family. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Jealousy, hatred, envy, anger, festering for years in that family. And then he's got 12 sons, but he really likes one of them. He really likes one of them. You know, a lot of you have got more than one son. I've got 3. How do you think it would work if I gave evidence daily for 20 or 30 years that I loved one of those children way more than the others? You think there would be hatred engendered between them? In Genesis 37, verse 3, Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children. Whew! That's 11 of them. He loved Jacob more than all of them combined because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Here's a family that should have loved and supported one another, but they hated one another. To the point that Jacob's sons sell their brother in Genesis 37. They took Joseph's coat, the one his father gave him, and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood, and they sent the coat of many colors. And they brought it to their father and said, This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it and said, It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. They fooled him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all of his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. Rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. Have you lost a son? Some of you have. How long did it hurt? How long did you mourn? And he said, for I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. The hypocritical rascals tried to comfort him. Real comfort wasn't given. Real comfort would have been to confess what they'd done and go out and try to fix it. But they didn't do that. Then they would have had to tell the truth. So it's easier to lie to their father. And their hypocritical comfort was useless. You know, the case of David is just sort of amazing. Every now and then I see Christians who haven't done well with their children. And they feel like they've failed God and they just can't be forgiven for it. But David's a good example of the fact that you can be a good Christian and a lousy parent. We try to do our best. We try to follow the Lord's instructions, but sometimes there's just some people that are lousy parents. David's a good example of it. First of all, he had at least 5, I've forgotten the total of wives he had, at least 6 or 7. How do you think that worked? Could that have been a source of problem and difficulty? All those children from those wives, and Alan was talking about it there from Genesis 4 this morning and pointing out the fact that there was a change from the woman being a helper to her husband and the two being joined together and being one flesh. Now, suddenly you got 2 wives, and there's no real good reason for that. You can't be joined to more than one woman in God's eyes. Because if you're joined to more than one woman, the only reason for that is lust, sinful lust, and a desire for a large number of children. Suddenly, there's no idea of being a helper to your husband anymore. His lusts, the fact he had all the money he could use, undoubtedly contributed to that problem. It was a terrible curse. In 2 Samuel 12, the Lord says, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes and give them unto thy neighbor. And he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this son. It was with his son. His son took those women. Thou didst it secretly, I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. In Exodus 20 and verse 5, thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. And that happened in his family. You know, when we disobey God's law, God's will, God's direction for the family, don't imagine that your family is going to escape. It'll travel on down through the generations to your children, and it'll be a source of problem. They'll fight against it their whole lives. There was incest in his family because he'd married several different wives. So the child of one wife lusted after the child of another wife. They didn't live in the same house. They were only distantly related. Amnon was feigning sickness. Tamar, his sister, is sent to comfort him, and he takes her and rapes her. And his brother is furious. Tamar's brother is furious. Begins to plot how he can kill her. You might notice the 18th chapter of Leviticus. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of thy father or the nakedness of thy mother shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father or daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness shalt thou not uncover. The nakedness of thy son's daughter or thy daughter's daughter, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover, for theirs is their own nakedness. You know, we read in the paper of incest in families. Some father who has abused his children and grandchildren. The nakedness of thy father's wife's daughter, begotten of thy father, she is thy sister. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's sister. She is thy father's near kinswoman. You know, we sometimes laugh at these folks that go around marrying cousins. There's a movie I like to watch every now and then where they were abusing the people of one town in Texas were abusing folks in another town, and they abused them, said they were cousin kissers. I think they meant by that they were about the lowest of the low. Verse 14, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's brother. Thou shalt not approach to his wife. She is thine aunt. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter-in-law. She is thy son's wife. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It's thy brother's wife. The hatred was profound. Absalom hated Amnon and began to plot against him. And David, for some reason or another, David ignores him. He kills his brother, and David still ignores him. He exiles him. Let me just tell you this, if you're thinking about disciplining your children, every now and then I see people that we've gotten to where we're scared to death to discipline our kids. Scared to death. Probably the middle of Walmart isn't the place to spank them anymore. But so many parents discipline their kids by sending them off to their room. Ooh. Up there where they have their TV and their computer and their, what is that thing you play with, Jonathan? Where I see you staring at your hand in the back of the car. What is that thing? Come on, what's the name of it? What? It's not a tablet. What is it? Ethan knows it. A DS. He plays with his DS up there in his room all by himself. What a terrible thing. But let me tell you something. What you're doing is you're ignoring that child. Got quiet for you. Kid's locked in his room, but you're ignoring him. That's what David did to Absalom. He ignored him for years. Stuck him off and ignored him. You know, Ignoring a child is hatred. That's a mean thing to do. It is not discipline. Discipline does not ignore the child. In 2 Samuel, 13th chapter, verse 38, Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead, but he didn't go. In 2 Samuel 14, verse 24, the king finally relents. He still doesn't see him, but he says he can come back to Jerusalem and live. He says, let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. You might notice in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, what discipline is. Ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of thy Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. It's not ignoring him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? If ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. You know what they did with a bastard? They didn't want to talk about him. They didn't want to speak about him. They just ignored him. He was an embarrassment. And so my son is becoming embarrassed. Go to your room. And I'm going to ignore him. Hebrews 12 is saying, hey, you're dealing with that child just like you would a bastard. You're ignoring him. He doesn't need ignored. He needs chastened. Deal with him. Rebuke him. If he's too old to spank, and by the way, that's pretty old, then rebuke him. We've had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous. You ever been chastened, Jason? Never? You've been a good child your whole life? Your folks never had to say, I'm going to take a paddle to your bottom? No? Never? What? Ah, the truth comes out. But it's been a long time ago, right? Because you've been such a good young man ever since. Is that right? Only your sister needed to be, right? He says it doesn't seem to be joyous at the time, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward, it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness. You and your sister turned out pretty well, Jason, because of that chastening. There was civil war that came about as a result of their family situation. Absalom rebelled. He took the wives of David. In 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, it's reported commonly that there's fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife, and Absalom did that. Here's a family where there should have been love and support and kindness and discipline, and it broke down. And yet the Bible calls David a man after God's own heart, and he was. Didn't know a thing about raising kids. But you know, that begins to sound pretty bad. I got to say something else. On the other hand, there were families where it worked. You remember Abraham gave Lot the choice land. He said, look, we're having trouble here in our family. We're having trouble between your herdsman and my herdsman. Here's the land. You pick the best part or pick the part you want, and I'll go somewhere else, and we'll get along that way. Can you do that in your family? Can you say, hey, we're family, we're going to get along. Let's find a way. Let's make it work. I'm going to give you the choice. You go first. I'll give you the big half of the Snickers bar. You get to pick which one you want. Joseph, who was so abused by his brothers, loved them. There at the end, when he saw their abject repentance, he loved his brothers and did his best for them. You didn't have to be filled with hatred. Ruth, we spoke of this morning, loved her mother-in-law to the point that she was willing to give up any life she had known with her family before and be with her mother-in-law. Every now and then I hear people talk about, oh, my mother-in-law, so difficult. Well, that wasn't what Ruth said. It wasn't her attitude toward her mother-in-law. She loved her. Timothy had the best example imaginable in his grandmother and his mother. So family doesn't have to be destructive. Doesn't have to be that way. And Jesus, the Son of God, was entrusted to Mary for 30 years because there was a realization that she would be a good mother and raise him up and protect him, discipline him, guide him, and love him. And so all the examples in the Bible aren't bad. And it may be that you have to overcome some of the things that your family taught you, but you can. And if you have failed your family, you can be forgiven. If you're here this evening, you can be forgiven. Believe, repent, confess, come and be baptized. And start off again with your family, going in the right direction. If you're already a Christian and you feel like, hey, I have failed and I need to fix it, now's the time. Come while we stand and sing. There's a fountain free.